Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene the second of five sessions on Compassion 2.0. When you think of compassion in a world such as ours, it almost seems like a non sequitur, particularly what's going on in Ukraine and over the weekend in the Middle East. But world events, as we're bearing witness to, underscore in an ever more urgent way for the human community to embrace compassion as not only a human ideal, but as a practical way of life. I started yesterday by commenting on the events over the weekend as Hamas attacked Israel and launched a war in that part of the world. I made the observation that in many ways Israel was experiencing on October 7th what the United States experienced on September 11th. Many years ago, 22 years ago, an abrupt attack that shattered all the categories of cognition and political arrangements that people were assuming were operating in the Middle East. And Israel, is now in the process of hitting back with massive force against the people of Gaza and also on the West Bank. And I want to continue, as I will each day this week, reflections on what it is that we're observing. The comment that I want to make today is for us to just reflect on the categories that are being used to describe the event in the public domain and across all the airwaves in North America and Europe, bearing in mind that the rest of the world is not interpreting this event in the same way. And I'll get to that in a moment, but it's very important for us to take in those of us who are Americans or Canadians or Western Europeans, Israelis, obviously, that the narrative that is now being shaped in the public domain is very specific. And it comes out of a very time-worn playbook. What do you have? You have Hamas as a terrorist group launching an unprovoked attack on an innocent victim, Israel. And in response to that, Israel, with the full backing of NATO and the Western Alliance and the United States, feels now justified to crush the Palestinians probably before it's over in ways that are going to defy imagination. Already, thousands of people have been killed. And I think it's important for all of us to understand that this was the same playbook that was used to justify the war in Ukraine. Russia was the terrorist state. Putin was the Hitler-like figure, an unprovoked invasion. And the West, to save civilization, needs to go to war at a massive level to defeat the enemy and produce, in that case, regime change in Russia. It was what was used when the United States justified going into Afghanistan and Iraq. When I was a young man, it was what the United States used to justify the war in Vietnam. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese engaged in an unprovoked attack. That's always the code word that's used. A terrorist organization engaging in an unprovoked attack that justifies then overwhelming force and the initiation of essentially total war, mostly against civilians. We are now in that playbook. And the public has become so conditioned, like a Pavlovian response, that when they hear terrorist, when they hear unprovoked attack, and they hear we're now going to get them to save civilization as we know it, democracy as we know it, our way of life as we know it, the Pavlovian response is predictable, particularly when the mainstream press does not allow any real dissent. So people believe that this perspective, this narrative that they're being given is what is actually true. Now, I want to make two quick points before introducing our session. Number one, the rest of the world is not seeing it this way. And if you will have noted in the Chinese response or the Indian response or the Saudi response or the South African response, various countries in Latin America, they're looking at this narrative in a very, very different way. So like with what's going on in Ukraine, it's really important for us to understand that we are in a little bubble, and that bubble is a controlled messaging that is being utilized, and this is the second point, to justify war. This is about the war machine. This is about conquest. And because we don't understand the manipulation that is going on, and we believe this is true, we then support what will now unfold in Gaza of unbelievable carnage. I'd like to just conclude with referencing one of the great lines, I think, in the history of literature and political science by Voltaire. He said, if you can get me to believe absurdities, you can get me to commit any kind of atrocity. And when the war machine is activated and the devil is identified and the victim is identified, who is now going to create unimaginable carnage on the enemy, who deserves everything they're going to get, one is being caught up, not in reality, but in the absurdities of hate and war and conquest and power. And when we understand that is actually the psychodynamics that is taking place, we understand the urgency of disengaging from the prevailing narrative and understanding more deeply the underlying truth beneath the absurdities, which, if understood, would enable us to see that war is never the answer, even though it seems at the present moment so compelling. I'll be going more deeply into this tomorrow, because I want to examine tomorrow some of the absurdities that are at play, that are justifying in the public mind the atrocities that we're bearing witness to all around us. I would like to now introduce my good friend, Tom Eddington, who you know very well as a co-moderator and colleague here at Humanity Rising Network. So Tom, I know everybody already knows you, so I'll turn the program over to you. And thank you for once again putting together such an extraordinary program on Compassion 2.0.
Well, my pleasure, Jim, and thank you for your opening comments today, but also yesterday. You know, I appreciated the need to talk about what is going on in Gaza and Israel, but I also appreciated the recognition of yesterday here in the U.S. being in the Indigenous Day, and the reference to approximately 90 million people killed as the Europeans arrived in what's now known as South America, North America. And those 90 million people, roughly, it has created an energetic on these two continents that we're still suffering from. And I suspect is in part what's contributing to the narrative that exists today around war and the need for war and the belief that war is the answer. So delighted to have heard those comments from you yesterday and today. And for those of you who are joining us today, we would encourage you to go back and listen to yesterday's broadcast. This week, we're doing Compassion 2.0, why compassion is one of the most important solutions to today's problems, whether it's the conflict in Ukraine or Israel and Gaza, or climate change, or social injustice, or so many of the other, what we call here on Humanity Rising, the code red issues of the world. And we had a chance yesterday to talk about Compassion 2.0, how to measure flourishing, and why do we believe that compassion is the most important solution to today's problems. So building off of yesterday's conversation, we're focusing today on compassion, politics, and the common good. And I know it seems a bit of an oxymoron to be talking about compassion and politics and the common good, but we are delighted to have with us today three individuals who are going to help us explore that further. Jennifer Nadel is joining us from London. She is the director of the Compassion Politics at CCARE, the Center for Compassion, Altruism, Research, and Education at Stanford University. Dr. Jim Doty is joining us from Stanford. Jim is a neurosurgeon, author, and philanthropist, and many things. And we're also delighted to have Marianne Williamson joining us today, a current U.S. presidential candidate, author, political activist, and I think for most of our viewers, her reputation precedes her. So wonderful to have Jennifer and Jim with us now. And Marianne will be joining us probably in about 15 minutes or so. Carson, I'll turn it over to you to help frame today's conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Jennifer and Jim, for taking the time to join us. I'm very excited to have a conversation with you today. Compassion 2.0, for those that weren't with us yesterday, is really looking at the notion of compassion outside of a traditional Western frame of a virtue or one that involves a pity framework per se. And it's really looking at compassion from a scientifically validated perspective, of which we have one of the foremost researchers on the call with us along those lines. And what we're trying to do is to, from that vantage point, is to really understand what our pro-social nature can look like, in the sense of how do we unfold and then lean into this inherent characteristic, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but this inherent attribute of who and what we are and what the world might look like as a result. So today, again, it's around politics and also exploring the common good. So first, we are going to talk with Jennifer about her work. She's done incredible work in compassion in politics. And then again, as Tom mentioned, once Marianne joins, we're going to expand the conversation as well. So Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you. And, if you would just give the audience a very brief sense of, how you've arrived, where you've arrived, and, what your focus of your work is. And also, too, of course, the work that you're doing with Jim.
Thanks so much, Carson. And it's an absolute joy to be with you, especially given the crises that are facing our world right now. Compassion is more important than ever. I'll just give a snapshot of how I got here. So my background is I'm a barrister. I'm living in the UK. I'm American born. I was a network news correspondent, and then I ran for the UK Parliament and sat on the national executive of one of the political parties. And what I wanted to do was alleviate suffering in each of those professions. What I was interested in is how do we alleviate avoidable suffering? Suffering is, we know, an inevitable part of life, but what about that bit of suffering that isn't inevitable, that happens because of man's inaction or because of human cruelty or neglect? How can we target that? And really, after the result of your election, which led to President Trump, and in the UK, we left the European Union, it really, things fell apart. We became more divided than ever. And I became interested in how can we solve this schism? And it seemed to me that party politics as they're organized now was part of the problem. It's a winner and loser setup where one side wins and the other loses. It's based on conflict. It's based on an ideological war. And the really important questions that politics should be dealing with: how do we solve these humanitarian crises? How do we live together in peace? How do we ensure human flourishing get put into second place beneath competitive self-interest, political advancement, and winning the election? So we started in the UK. We're now spread all over the globe, thanks to wonderful volunteers in countries picking it up and running with it. And the idea is that we say to all those across every political party, if you want to prioritize compassion, come and join with us. It doesn't matter what party you're a member of, come and join with us. And in the UK, we have over 100 members of Parliament who are actively involved with our organization, and they come together to see how together on a cross-party basis we can solve some of the issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's hunger, whether it's homelessness, that affect us all, by prioritizing a compassionate response. One of the problems with our politics is that it's become about rightness. It's a battle over who's right and who's wrong. And truth gets lost in that. I love that Rumi quote, out beyond talk of right and wrong, there is a field and I will meet you there. That's where we need to be. We need to be there. And you mentioned the common good, Carson, and I know you've done a lot of work in that area, but we need to be there focusing on what's the common good. So that's what we do in brief, or not in brief. I can give you a bit more detail, but you may want me to pause there.
That's a great stopping point. Thank you for your introduction. So tell the audience for a moment, what is it that you're working on, say, right now? What's up and top of mind?
So we're looking at two things in particular. One is how we do politics. Our politics is triggered, and we all know that it's much harder to access compassion if we're in a fight, a flight, adrenal state. So how can we make politics a safer space? And that involves trust, that involves safety. So at the moment, we're building a coalition. We have elections coming up on both sides of the Atlantic next year to really look at how we can protect electoral integrity. How can we ensure more honesty? How can we ensure more trust? How can we improve the conduct of candidates? How can we reduce levels of toxicity? So we're looking at what interventions we can make there. And the other thing we do is we're always looking at, how can we alleviate suffering? How can we respond to the crises that are facing us? And climate change is obviously one of the ones that is foremost in that space, but you can't look at climate without looking at hunger and inequality and poor health comes stretched out across the globe. So we look at the substance, but also looking ahead to these elections. How can we protect our fragile democracies? We've seen how fragile they are. After January the 6th, we saw how fragile they are. So we really need to do, and it really falls to all of us to protect our democracies.
Yes, absolutely. Well said. And it's, one of the things that comes up for me as you're talking about this is, for me, I try to understand, more and more the root cause, some of the things that you're speaking to. And a couple questions. I think there's an extractive framework that we continue to find ourselves in. We continue to kind of what you were speaking to earlier about who's right, who's wrong. There's kind of a sum total of truth in the sense of I have more, you have less, and this notion of kind of a lack of a willingness to have a cognitive perspective taking and or effective empathy in the sense of well, wait a minute, what is your context? How are you seeing this? What are you feeling? And so from that perspective, I ask, do you, in your work, when you're working with politicians in particular, one of the organizations, of course, was Compassion in Politics. So the sense I wonder is, how do you convey that when you're speaking with, say, people that might be on, quote, the other side, or other colleagues that you're working with, in the sense of compassion as an explicit element that underlies the work, as opposed to things that are compassionate, which you're speaking to, namely environmental care and social care and so forth. I'm not sure if I'm
no, you're making complete sense. And one of the extraordinary things we found, it's so easy when you're sitting in your armchair watching television to be incredibly critical of politicians and the way they end up behaving. But most politicians are motivated by wanting to leave the world a better place, by wanting to do some good. And one of the things we find when we engage with politicians from whichever party is, if we take them back to that inner starting point, their inner integrity, what brought them into politics, they suddenly come alive and they start caring. And we've had some extraordinary successes in terms of policy by simply reminding or facilitating the remembering of why people come into politics. We become, in any career, but particularly in politics, it's so easy to lose sight of what the original motivation is. If we want to change the world, then we need to have power. If we want to have power, we've got to be realistic. That means we have to make compromises. So we start giving away parts of our authentic selves, letting go of things that really matter to us for reasons of expediency. And by the time we've finished, we've traveled so far from the person whom we really are, the person who decided to devote hours and hours traipsing the streets to try and engage with voters and win votes, and we forget. So actually, it's a lot about facilitating and enabling the innate moral knowing that exists within each human to come to the fore. And the other thing you mentioned was the extractive nature of the world in which we live. And, we have a very clear analysis at Compassion in Politics as to how we've got into this mess. Because if you look at every single social justice and humanitarian issue we're struggling with, doesn't matter what it is, they are all linked. And so often in politics, we go on an issue by issue basis, and it's like playing whack-a-mole. I'm going to target homelessness. Oh, but wait a minute, what about the health crisis? And you're kind of jumping from one crisis to another, and you're really dealing with the symptoms. And at Compassion in Politics, we say, what is the underlying cause? So if the symptoms are the tip of the iceberg, underneath it is the absence of compassion. And we really saw that becoming systemized with Reagan's election in the US, with Thatcher's election in the UK, with the bedding down of Friedmanite economics and the notion of competitive self-interest. And we really move from a we-based society to a me-based society, where everything is valued because of its commercial value, not because of those things that we can't put a financial value on: joy, bliss, freedom, peace.
Yeah.
Jeff,
Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to pick up on that because as you were speaking, I was curious to have you respond to, here in the US, the Republican Party still holds Reagan up as this incredible icon. And yet, whether we're talking about economics or otherwise, most of the policies that were in place over that 8-year period have been shown with the passage of time to have been a failure. And in the UK, the same with Margaret Thatcher. And yet, whether we're talking the Tories in the UK or the Republicans here in the US, there's no acknowledgement of the failure of those policies and a willingness. And what's required for the parties to move beyond something that hasn't worked, or it's worked for a select few.
Absolutely. And, one of the advantages of getting older is we have this historical perspective. We remember what events were like. My kids are now studying the things that I lived through, and I see how the history is written and how people are lionized, how complexities are smoothed out. The truth is it's messy, it's complicated. No one human, Reagan, Thatcher, no matter how much I struggle with the damage that they have wrought and the suffering they have caused, was purely bad. And often when we're back in our armchairs watching our screens, we want it to be like a Western movie. We know who the goodies are and the baddies are by the color of their hats. But it is so much more complicated and messy. And that's part of the problem with our binary system of politics, that we don't allow for the mess, and as we know, those of us on a spiritual journey, that it's that fecundity, it's that messiness, it's that time in the chrysalis that creates the beauty that then emerges. But we like to leap from absolute to absolute. And so, yes, I agree. As we move away in time from those people and those events, they tend to be rewritten. And of course, we live in a frightening time, and we know that the more fear there is in the public space, the more likely it is that voters are to reach for slightly more authoritarian figures, the more they are going to want strong leadership. So to look back in time and mistake some characters who appeared to be strong leaders for something more than they are is a mistake that's widespread at the moment.
I wanted to just jump in and build off something too, Jennifer, that you were speaking to earlier about this notion of issues versus, say, values. I know in my own experience at a smaller scale here in Northern California, where I am zooming in from, the work that I've done, I found and I did some progressive organizing, like I mentioned, I found that everybody seemed to share very similar notions of values. So, and I would ask things like, who's concerned about women's abortion, access to abortion? Who's concerned about the environment? And in a room of progressives, everybody's hand went up on everything. And what became interesting, though, is that then I said, okay, what should we work on first? And that's when the fracture happened, right? Everybody started saying, oh, no, well, if we don't have an environment that's clean and healthy, then what's the point of having a political frame that makes any sort of sense? Well, we can't have a healthy environment unless women have, the ERA is established and, all of these different things are happening over here. And that's when the divisions started to happen. And it became very clear to me that how to articulate this, that we are in this notion, it feels like we're in this notion of just perpetual self-interest, in the sense of like, these are the things that are dear and important to me at the expense at some level of other things. And I don't see the underlying value framework. And, we can talk about this with Jim and Marianne as well, but I'm kind of curious of what your experience has been. I mean, and also as an example, in terms of the tribalism too, on the quote, other side of the progressive side, I reflect too on DeSantis, who's a presidential candidate here in the United States on the Republican Party. The side of his tour bus says, never back down. And just the concept of selling oneself as a warrior on behalf of the tribe, and that he's never going to back down. It's a mind blower to me. And I just can't imagine that would be a campaign slogan from, say, the 40s or the 50s, for instance. I don't know, maybe that's just me being ideal. So any thoughts about kind of a shared value system?
Oh, you said so much. That's so interesting. And of course, it's very patriarchal. The messages that we're getting now cannot be separated from the tide of misogyny that we're seeing rise. There is something very patriarchal and dangerous about what we're seeing. but it's interesting what you say about shared values, because if you take an issue like safety, let's say, we can get agreement across parties on wanting to keep our families safe. That's a shared value. But then we look at how each side wants to do that. And one side wants to keep their families safe by always having a weapon in their hand. And the other side wants to keep their family safe by not allowing anyone to have guns. So we can have these shared values, but then when we start to unpick it, it becomes much more complicated. And there's where we need to bring science and experts, which are becoming, unfortunately, increasingly unfashionable, into the space. But I just wanted to say something about factionism on the progressive side as well, because I sometimes see more of a problem on the progressive side, certainly here in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same with you, by people who think that they're right, and moral indignation, and we other those we disagree with in a way. We campaign to stop, to build bridges, not walls. And yet in the way that we deal with our political rivals, we other them in exactly the same way, in psychological ways. And I think we have to really look at our addiction to rightness, because rightness, as we know, has no real place. It bolsters us. It's like a drug. It makes us feel invincible. So we can criticize DeSantis for his slogan, but how often are we getting on our charger and, wielding the sword of rightness and feeling incredibly heroic about it without real regard to how that sword lands on someone else? And just finally, to pick up on your point that you said about we can get agreement on issues, but then how do we prioritize them? And that for me is why, if we focus on compassion, and I think there are 4 core policies around compassion, then everything else falls into place. So if we're trying to alleviate suffering, then that gives us a clear set of priorities. If we're trying to reduce intergenerational inequity, that it gives us a clear set of principles. So the principles that we are working with is, how can we at the very least ensure our actions don't create more harm to those in the most vulnerable circumstances? So let's just start there. Let's start with the no harm principle. At its most basic level, how can we ensure those who have power don't cause harm to those who are originally or already vulnerable and marginalized? So that's the starting place. And then we can put compassion across the whole public space.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to bring Jim and Marianne into the conversation, but just a quick question for you. When I listen to people, and wherever they are on the political spectrum, their affiliation with a party tends to be emotional, as opposed to logical. Their perspective on any particular issue tends to be emotional, not logical. When presented with facts, data, science, the emotion tends to override that. And I'm just curious, particularly in looking through the lens of compassion, how do we speak to that?
Well, we live in a society where the basic psychological needs to belong, to feel valued, to have a sense of agency, to feel loved are completely unmet. So it's like any human, if you don't have nutritious food to eat, you're going to grab whatever's going. So if we don't build a society in a world where people feel cared for and are looked after and are valued and have agency and their labor is properly rewarded, we're going to have people who are going to reach for anything that simulates the meeting of that real need to have agency and belong. Whereas, of course, we know that it's ultimately, the wrong direction, but we can understand that. So society needs to meet our needs. And if it doesn't meet our needs, then humans will naturally reach for anything that looks as if it's feeding their needs, hence the rise of extremism.
Well, I think
go ahead, Marianne. I was going to ask Jim to step in so you could have a moment to get settled, but if you're ready, please join the conversation.
I agree 100% with what you said, Tom, and I agree with what you said too, Jennifer. And I think that the point there is exactly what you guys said. People are looking to a political party like their family. That's why Democrats have such a codependent relationship with the DNC. It's almost like an abuse. It's exactly what you guys said. People are looking to their political party. It's as well, they're my brotherhood, they're my family. Like Jennifer said, they'll just grab it wherever they can for a sense of belonging. And it's really self-sabotaging at this moment, because it's not a family you should trust. You need to build real family, not that one, not the ersatz version. Yeah, I agree with you guys.
Jim, can we bring you into the conversation?
Pardon?
I was asking Jim if he'd like to join the conversation.
Sure, of course. How can I be of service?
May I say one more thing about that? In a weird way, and I would never say this publicly, in a weird way, in terms of what you guys were just saying, Republicans' attitude towards their party, not towards Donald Trump, because I think towards Donald Trump, it's what you both said, it's like cult family. But in general, about the party, Republicans are more psychologically mature about their connection to the Republican Party than Democrats are to the Democratic Party. The Democrats are more stuck in a childish mode of misplaced devotion. It's just interesting.
I completely agree. And just to bring in your book, Marianne, you know, The Politics of Love, that says it all. That's what the direction we need to be headed in. And it's the antithesis of what we have now.
Neither party stands for that.
I would offer too, you know, in my experience organizing, one of the things that I seem to see, and maybe this isn't right, but it seems to me that the progressive versus the conservative projects are so very fundamentally different from one another in that sense too, right? So on the one hand, a conservative project stands in the present and looks to the past as to what the future should look like. Namely, there's just a few problems that need to be solved in a, you know, particularly in the current US frame of some of the political discussion. Namely, if we just keep these people off our southern borders, if we just cannot let trans people use bathrooms, you know, whatever these things are, then we're going to go back to a time where things are great. So we have a few targets that we need to work on. But the progressive side seems to stand in the present, and to imagine the future, they look to the future. Namely, there's so many different things that we can make progress on. We can improve. We can make women's access to abortion and healthcare greater. We can serve people in some better fashion. We can be more welcoming and so forth. So I wonder if just by the inherent nature, because Marianne, what you just said about the Republicans' relationship to their party, that's a very interesting idea to me in that sense. And I just wonder if part of that has to do with the fact that the traditional conservative model has much, much fewer, I don't want to say targets, but the frame is so much more constrained and simple, as opposed to the progressive side, which has so much opportunity that there's a ton of squabbling that seems to happen in the sense of being able to concentrate force and move forward in a unified.
But that's the point. The Republican Party is, even though now it's corrupted by all the things we know it's corrupted by and so forth, in general, it remains a container for those conservative principles you said. The problem, that the crisis, this is a huge crisis in America. The Democratic Party is at present not actually a container for serious progressive values. We don't have a political container for what you just described. So the Democratic Party works to suppress progressive values, have them fall in line, even Bernie, even AOC, and suppress candidacies. So those progressive values and principles the flowers are growing everywhere. We got the flowers and the seeds, and we got a whole younger generation growing up with those flowers. We don't have a container for it in terms of political party at this moment. That's why the fact that the Democratic Party is no longer a serious container in the level of really putting out political force for those things is terrible.
I think you're right.
Terrible.
Does anybody else have any thoughts about this?
Well, before you joined, Marianne, I was saying the same thing about the UK politics, that actually some of the nastiest squabbles I've seen have been the centre left, and that the othering that takes place in that space is so much more intolerant, and it's deeply disturbing. And that's why we need, love to be our guide, because rightness is one of the things that drives love out. And that's what we have to a large extent on the progressive side. That spiritual and psychological element is missing.
So I'm also curious to know too, at this point, what is the antidote in a very practical, real way? I know, and Marianne, of course, you are running to provide this at some level. So I'm curious to know kind of what your thoughts are, and also how that might relate to a discussion around the common good.
There is no, once again, political party in the United States today who stands first and foremost, unequivocally, unabashedly, no matter what, for the common good. That's
So
disastrous. Pardon?
There's that detail.
There's that.
Yeah.
There's that.
What do we do? How do we respond? And I don't know, Jim, if you have any thoughts on this from your perspective as being a world-renowned neurosurgeon and the incredible work you've done with CCARE and His Holiness and so forth. How do we move from this tribalistic frame where we have this, this growing division from what feels like kind of a dying modality of patriarchy, and relative to that, some, in my opinion of it, at least some emerging sense of some new modality that reclaims a feminine principle along with the masculine, and is something hybrid that's new, and we move forward, right? Regardless if that's not the right frame, how do we move out of this tribalism? What do we do next?
Well, I think in some ways we are. I think that, as you probably know, there are 144 million voters in the United States who didn't vote, or I should say people who didn't vote. So there's a massive population there. And the reality is that I think both in the context of the younger generation, the Gen Zs or the millennials, they're disgusted. And they also have seen what has happened to, if you want to call it the American dream, or their ability to thrive and prosper in a society in which we have destruction of our climate, sustainability issues, and fundamentally a deterioration of way of life in the United States. And I agree with both Jennifer and Marianne that this is not a one-sided problem. It is in both parties. And then the other aspect, of course, is it is fundamentally impossible to create a third party. You look at other countries where they have multiple parties. What ultimately happens is there has to be compromise. They have to come together. And then while one may not like something particular in the overall picture of what's being offered, they're willing to accept it. And this gets to the nature of compromise. It's interesting that it seems as though no matter what anyone says, the opposing party is immediately critical, and if it's not even reality, they make up a narrative that diminishes the accomplishment or criticizes it for not really factual reasons. As an example, if you look at right now, in terms of the economy, there's been a massive improvement in the number of jobs. And then suddenly, the Republican Party doesn't want to comment on that or even give praise to that. So then they go back to another issue, which is, and you mentioned, Carson, whether it's the border, whether it's LGBTQI issues, they have to find something to polarize their population because that creates fear, which then creates attachment to a narrative and a joining together to oppose that. Ultimately, what has to happen is we have to acknowledge people who are doing good work and also make factual comments on those who could do better. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to human connection, respect, recognizing the dignity of everyone. And if somebody is immediately criticized, as in one case we know, Hillary Clinton called it a group of despicables, then you have turned off a huge swath of the population. The question is can we mobilize that 144 million individuals who don't vote? Can we create a narrative that is inspiring to the younger population and presents a message of a possible future that many of these problems are addressed. And the problem is, who can do that? Certainly, I have immense respect for Marianne. I think she's, relentlessly has promoted an agenda that is actually an agenda. If you look at the policies of the Republican Party, I mean, frankly, they're non-existent almost. They're, and again, this isn't a criticism, I think it's factual. They haven't put in the work to define a set of policies or values that they're going to seek to promote. It always almost invariably has to do us against them. It shouldn't be that. It should be, how can we improve the lot of all Americans? It has nothing to do with party. Our agendas should always be, what can we do to benefit everyone? And if you're able to do that, then you can bring people together. You can't do it by sitting there saying, okay, we're in power now. We're going to put all the judges who opposed us, every politician who opposed us, anybody who was against us, we're going to put them in jail. And as has been a narrative, which I'm shocked by, we should execute one of our leading generals who's been a war hero. Or we should diminish somebody like McCain, who sacrificed so much for his country, and he's called a loser. How is this even possible? And so I think people buy into this to be part of something that makes them feel safe. But I think we have the ability to offer them something that will change their lives and hopefully change the lives of others. But this brings up another issue, is that to run, you get beaten up, and who wants to get beaten up every day by these extreme views? Or the reality, you can't become a player because the game is fixed right from the start.
The game is colder than people even think. So when you said a couple of minutes ago, we have to create a narrative, we've created the narrative. We've created the freaking narrative. The issue is the huge forces in the media and in the political system that suppress our narrative. We have the narrative enough. We've had the narrative, and like you said, we have the policies. And I'll tell you, from being a candidate, I see it this time. I saw it last time. The American people are decent. The American people, it's not like the American people don't get it. Even if you look at poll after poll, we're a little bit to the left of center. The majority of Republicans as well as Democrats want Medicare for all, making people's lives better. The majority of Republicans as well as Democrats want tuition-free college, making people's lives better. The majority of Republicans as well as Democrats, including gun owners, want common sense gun safety laws, making people's lives better. We have the sentiment, we have the narrative, and we have the agenda. But it is almost mafia-like. There is and I'm telling you, from the inside of the beast, it is a political media industrial complex. And I used to think they just chop wood and carry water for corporate interests. What I see now on a deeper level than I ever saw before, they are a corporate interest. So when the tragedy here, and I see it every day. I see it, one day I do this super glamorous luncheon someone puts with a bunch of very wealthy people. The next day I do students who obviously they're on college loans. The narrative works across the board. But the suppression, the lengths that the system goes to suppress a genuinely progressive message, even within the Democratic Party, which is what all of us were brought up to think, well, we could have a shot in there at least. Franklin Roosevelt at one point, towards the end, the Southern racist senators in his party were so great. He had actually gone to Wendell Willkie and said, let's start a new party. But as you said, the third party issue is difficult. Although on the other hand, what Bobby Kennedy says about the rigging by the Democratic Party, he's right. He's accurate. And the old world is dying. The old world is dying.
Just picking up on something you said, and I want to take it back to a comment that Jennifer made earlier. When you say that they, are you speaking to the leadership of the RNC and the DNC? Are you talking about?
Because I'm running as a Democrat. The CNN and MSNBC are basically to the Democrats what Fox is to the Republicans.
Right.
They're the mouthpieces. It's like state TV or something.
Yep. So when you say the they, though, you're talking about the heads of the networks. You're talking about the collaboration with the heads of the RNC and the DNC.
Not the RNC. I mean, the RNC, I assume they do their own thing. I mean,
Right.
But although it seems in some weird way that even though the Democrats have the more egalitarian policies, they have the more elitist relationship to their own constituency. The Republicans have the more elitist, corporatist policies, but on almost weirdly more egalitarian relationship to their own constituency, although that did produce Trump. So the DNC is saying that's why we can't let Marianne Williamson, we might get a. But if I may, and I don't want to hog, but I do want to make one point here that goes back to the first thing you said, Carson, when you said, how do we take this moment and move forward? This is what I'm feeling and experiencing. It's kind of like with what's happening in Israel right now. There are moments that are so beyond any level of rational ability to fix, where you are confronted by roadblocks to anything that your mindset might currently see as a pathway. That's where your book comes in, James, and that's where religion comes in. And I think there's a law in physics, right? Those of you who are scientists would know much more than I. There is a moment where you go into the void. There's just a void. There's no, you could say we need an agenda. We have an agenda. You could say we need a party, but what do we do? Blah, blah, blah. Where every door that you rationally come up with, it's Moses standing before the Red Sea. If you go forward, you're going to drown. If you go back, the Egyptian soldiers are going to take you back. And I think we're in that moment. And I think it's very Eastern and feel empty mind, Zen mind. It's this, we're in this moment of the mind can't do it. The mind can't do it. It's the leap of faith. It's Kierkegaard. It's this moment of emptiness. And I think we all have to get there because the Western mind, we're asking Western questions. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And the East would say, just wipe your, it's like when Einstein said, you won't solve the problems, from the level of thinking you created them. I think we're all in this emptiness. And maybe instead of being at the first reaction of that to the Western mind is horror. Oh my God, I have nothing to offer. Oh my God, I have nothing to offer. But I think there's something here about solidarity in the void.
It's fascinating.
Something here about our just joining each other, knowing we're in some empty moment, and out of that emptiness, something new will emerge because that's the way of nature.
I'm so interested in what you just said there and I would ask Jim this, and Jim is a neurosurgeon. I'm not sure if this is totally in your lane, but I'm very, very curious. The raging willful ignorance on both sides is the thing that just strikes me so deeply right now in the sense of what, as an example of what Jim said. Here you have Senator John McCain, who gave an unbelievable sacrifice to his country over the course of his life. And the Republican Party, and I'm not just trying to bag on the Republican Party, there's examples of this everywhere, but this one particular one that Jim spoke to is just unbelievable to me, that the Republican lead candidate, the group of people that is supposed to be about military and law and order and honor and service to the country, has turned on one of the most incredible heroes, arguably in terms of sacrifice, so much so that the president and leader of the party, while in the office, had to have the actual naval vessel named after him, after John McCain, had to be removed from his sight when he was on an aircraft carrier, something along those lines. I'm not sure if those are the exact details, but how is it that there's such like this, and maybe Marianne, it's maybe this void that you're speaking about, but there's this notion of this positing of negativity in the sense, it's like this active negation that just logically does not make any sort of sense. And I'm just really curious, Jim, if you happen to have any thoughts, A, if you think that this might even be somewhat true, but B, if so, what is the neuroscience behind this? What is the tribal difference? Like what's going on in the amygdala and or other parts of the brain here that might be leading to this mass hysteria, again, on both sides. I'm not just speaking to the Republicans.
Well, I think you could also look at, if you recall, supporting Russia at one point was embraced by or was condemned by the Republican Party. And then, oftentimes on the left, people would try to say, well, communism isn't that bad. But this, of course, was decades and decades ago. But suddenly what is extraordinary is the embracing of Putin and Russia, when fundamentally, historically, for decades, Russia has been our enemy. And it's sort of fascinating. Now they've embraced Russia. And in fact, some would argue that that our president, Trump, at one time was getting so close that he was potentially compromising state secrets. And so how do you even get there? That's a good question. But what happens is, again, in some ways, you're seeing the fundamental examples of what brainwashing does. And they're going by a classic book of fascism to turn one group against another, to condemn anything of value within the other, to objectify them as an enemy, not as human beings. And I think that this is a method that is well demonstrated in a variety of books about how do you promote fascism. And, you can look at, how is it even possible that almost any human being would be against racism or not against, like promoting white supremacy or promoting taking over the country, what everyone has acknowledged is a country of many religions. It was never founded on a Judeo-Christian ethic. But again, we've altered reality in some ways, what Marianne was saying, to include stuff that doesn't even exist. And where before, if you were a neo-Nazi, you would hide because you would be condemned so loudly. Yet now we have, I think, Carrie Lake and some other candidates who are using these people as their bodyguards, which is like unfathomable. But it's a form of brainwashing. And again, you have to remember, as Jennifer was saying, you have a group of people who've been disenfranchised, who've been ignored by both parties, and you have an individual whose whole life has been creating false narratives that have been accepted. And Mr. Trump is one, I have to acknowledge, he is one of the best people I have ever seen at this type of ability to brainwash people. He knows exactly what it takes to touch the weaknesses of people, to turn one group of people against another. Now, the other thing I think is very important to emphasize is there's a Supreme Court decision about Citizens United. And what happened here is it allowed for corporate entities to give unlimited money to PACs. And what has happened here is that if you look at, Princeton did this study a few years ago, it looked at corruption in politics. And it basically said that if you were in the lower 90% of people, and you either wanted something to be passed, and in fact, let's say the majority of people vastly wanted it to be passed, or you wanted something not to pass, a vast majority of people wanted that, the likelihood of either of them passing was essentially zero. If you were among the ultra wealthy or corporate entity, you had a 60 to 90% chance of that government policy being changed in your favor. And if those individuals, the corporate entities or the wealthy class, did not want something to pass, there was essentially 100% chance it would not pass. That is one of the other fundamental problems, because now you were able to buy politicians. These entities actually hand them the legislation they want them to pass, and they say, yes, sir, 3 bags full. And then they create their own narrative of lies about why they made a decision, when the fundamental aspect was it was to be reelected and get those dollars. And I think that is a cancer that has been eating away at American democracy. And what we should do is provide funding for candidates who pass certain initial tests, and then no more funds can come into it. And I think in some ways that is something that could also help our democracy.
Yeah, agreed. One thing too, Marianne, I'd like to come back to you and talk a little bit more about the void for a moment, because I think this is profound, but yet I think it'd be interesting to hear some more clarity about kind of what your thoughts are about that. Are you suggesting that we're in a space now that how to say, where things are kind of so off the rails that we just need to be in this space of just being. And from that space, something will come forward that will be more of a solution, or I'm not entirely clear. Would you be
Well,
willing?
I'm not saying we shouldn't act. You know, it's like, it's very Eastern in feel. The thing comes out of the no thing. It's
Sure.
like when they say in AA, you have to let your knees hit the floor. You know, when they say in AA, they say you have to come to the point of realizing your life is unmanageable. And only a higher power can do this for you. We have to come to that point. We've come to the end of what our rational mind can do. And we're faced with evil at this point. And we have to move into the ability to accept the non-rational. The non-rational is not irrational. Ultimately, love restores reason and not the other way around. But we have to go to a place inside ourselves of complete acceptance. Now, that doesn't mean you don't act. I'm saying you have to go into that space of pure being before the kinds of breakthrough solutions come. However, with what Jim was saying just now, I submit that we've all been saying that, we know that. And one of the things we do on our side is we process. They don't sit and obsess about us. We only sit and obsess about them. We are going on and on about what they've done. John McCain. And the other day, Jim, I don't know if you saw, Trump literally quoted Mein Kampf the other day, talking about immigrants at the border. They are poisoning Americans' blood. I mean, it's like unbelievable. However, we don't have time. We don't have time. We're like if you're a professional athlete and you're playing tennis, and all of a sudden you make a mistake that you haven't made since the 6th grade. You're in the tennis game. You don't have a fraction of a second to say, fuck. You have to just keep playing. And I think that there's a difference between surrender and paralysis. And we have to be, and the surrender kind of gives you, let's go to the solution. And I particularly feel as a candidate, and I don't mean to personalize this, except it is, but like take me, that I'm me out of it. Let's say I was just by someone else. You have in front of you a candidate who is doing everything everybody here is saying. So why is it that so many people, and talking from this conversation that I've been in for decades, as we all have, what I'm fascinated in analyzing is not Trump. What I'm fascinated in analyzing is the people who haven't sent a check to my campaign. We say we have to create a narrative. Check. All of us have created it. I'm not any better than anybody else, but we do need some soloists to put it out. In the game, talking to people, got it. And I find that a weird paralysis. And that gang is going to say, hey, let's keep going with Biden, even though that represents nothing strong enough to override fascism. Only thing that's going to override fascism, it's what Franklin Roosevelt said. He said, we will not have to worry about a fascist takeover in America as long as democracy delivers on its blessings. Democracy is not delivered on its blessings. That would mean we had universal health care. That would mean we had tuition-free college. That would mean a cancellation of the college loan debt. That would mean we had free childcare. That would mean we have a guaranteed livable wage. That would mean we have paid family leave. We all know this. And so we can talk about compassionate. Well, what we need is a compassionate agenda. Well, kind of got that. And it's so easy. The system, they character assassinate. Even if it weren't me, I would be shocked by how easy it has been for them to throw people off the scent. Oh, she's crazy, she's kooky, she's abusive to her staff. And how people who like to think of themselves as too sophisticated to ever be taken in by anonymous quotes on Twitter. So I'm kind of sitting here seeing the insanity on every. So I don't mean to I feel it weakens the argument to make it about me, except I happen to be the one standing in that space. We need to both surrender, go into the not knowing, and get going. They're both the same. We have to completely accept and go. But instead, there's a difference between surrender and paralysis. And I find when there's complete surrender is when you do. So I don't want to analyze them anymore. We get it. They're evil. What are we
Yeah,
gonna do?
I think you're right. And when I was doing my progressive organizing when Trump got elected, that was the thing that struck me is kind of waking up one day going, we're unfortunately, and I don't like to use this language per se, but until there's something better, we're in war in a sense. And the problem is that we didn't declare it in the sense of the progressive side, but we haven't been waking up to the fact that we are in one. Because the other side, to Jim's point and to some of these other points have been made, that there has been a concentrated, coordinated resource gathering army, for a lack of a better term, that has been created. And now they have found their field marshal, so to speak, in the sense of in this man that they're going to follow, and logic is gone. It's like what Jim said with the Voltaire quote earlier, in the sense of you can, get me to believe the absurdities, I'm willing to do the atrocities, or whatever the actual words are, I don't remember, but that's the exact thing that Jim Garrison said he spoke to. And I think that's what we're seeing. So to me, it just comes back to this place of like, what happened to the common good? What happened to this space where we took care of one another at one level? And we had the notion, at least in the United States, of the democratic principles of saying, we leave religion over here, we leave some of these things over here, and we can engage in a civic conversation about what's in our best interest to educate our children, for instance, or to be able to have commerce together, or whatever it might be. And it feels like that common good is no longer. It feels like we have just been played in terms of the sense of self-interest from maybe the political, corporate, industrial complex like you were speaking to, Marianne, and or other sort of complexes. So I'm kind of curious to know, here we are, do we need to arm ourselves metaphorically? Do we need to concentrate and start
You said
deploying
yourself,
force?
there are progressive candidates running for Congress. There are progressive candidates running for Senate. There have been progressive candidates running for president. And here is a group of people saying, where's compassion, but not supporting these progressive candidates. If you want to know where it is, it's all these progressive candidates who for decades now have had been suppressed at the primary level. And we're having this elite, oh goodness, where's the common good? The common good is expressed in the politics of these progressive candidates and the group of people who aren't just supposedly, we have all been the incubator for these ideas, and we're still acting like, where is it? It's right here.
So we have to overcome the political machines and so
No.
forth.
No. We have to overcome the part of ourselves.
That's what I mean.
Willfully blind to this.
That's
and not
my
get involved politically, and
root.
has to get involved on the primary level, like you said, it's a war. And get over any like, well, we just vote blue, or when that's infused with corporatism too. If you're really serious about it, look at the primary level. Yeah. It's happening, and because of what you said before, when the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is recruiting candidates, the first thing they say is, can you self-fund? That means you have $1 million lying around. That's not where you're going to find the progressive richness of candidates. It's people who are begging for a check for $50 or $100. And we're not getting in there to support that. We really need to stop pretending like, oh, where's the common good? When there are people, not just me, many people on the congressional, on the mayoral, on the state legislature, on the Senate, they are running.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Jennifer, you have been quiet. I'm curious, kind of what's up for you and what your thoughts are as part of this conversation.
Well, I was very struck what Marianne said about the void, and I was thinking about, what follows a void. And I was thinking about hope, and what we don't have on the progressive side at the moment is the opportunity for vision. And, I would encourage anyone to look at Marianne's website if they want to know what politics could look like. I would love to have a politician running with that agenda in the UK. But how do we create a sense of hope? Because at the moment, we're scared. It's like we've got Stockholm syndrome. We can see this beautiful option here, but just as we accuse the Republicans of governing by fear, we ourselves are frightened. So we stick with the Biden, we stick with whomever we think is going to win, instead of saying, what do I believe in? What is my authentic truth? Because we can't, as we know from Martin Luther King, drive out hate with hate. We have to start a revolution of love.
And it has to be a revolution at the ballot box.
Absolutely. And exactly. And this whole patriarchal notion that love belongs in one category and government belongs in another. You know, we have been convinced that politics is an emotionless space, that somehow to care, to bring the feminine into that space is to be unprofessional, irrational, mad, histrionic. It's absolutely the antithesis. The reason we have got into the mess we have got into is because of the lie we've been told that we're not psychological, emotional, and spiritual beings, and that the political space can be one that is clean of all of those things. So that's number one. The other is, if we want to protect ourselves from fascism, we have to connect. You know, compassion, first base, is about connection. The stronger we connect one to another, the more resilient we become. And this has a knock-on effect for whom we feel safe enough to vote for, because we know that the safer an individual feels, the more progressive their values become. So if we can create more safety within our communities, we are more likely to feel safe enough to take a chance on what we really believe in, and to take that leap of faith and actually allow ourselves to think that what is true can flourish, can reign.
And Jennifer, just I'd like to pick up on something you said earlier in the conversation and bring it back to something Marianne said. And you know, the focus here has been primarily in the UK and the US, but you know, if anybody's been paying attention, the world has lost about 40% of its democracies in the last couple of decades. So this isn't a unique American or UK perspective. This is happening around the world, and so you know, the conversation is global. It's not a you know, just a US or UK perspective. But
sorry, Tom, to jump in, but there was something I've been meaning to say, which is that we're talking about democracy as if we have democracy. We don't have democracy. We have a first past the post voting system where a huge number of people, you know, in the UK, 49%, 51%, same with Trump, didn't vote for the person who won. Their votes are completely wasted in this system. So we have to look at what is really democracy. We have to look at citizens' assemblies. We have to look at constituents having the capacity to recall their elected representatives when they fail to stick by their promises. As Marianne is so powerful and Jim has so powerfully said, we have to look at moving money out of the election space. So we don't really have democracy. We have something that can be bought. We have, you know, dictatorship by the majority, and that's very different.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on a point you said earlier in the broadcast, in the conversation, around when you're talking to individual elected officials and reminding them of why they ran in the first place, there's a shift in their consciousness. And so what is stopping, well, let me start with, what are you seeing actually happens when they shift their consciousness?
Extraordinary things. I'll give one example. We went to speak to one quite right-wing conservative about the budget that was coming up. We said, what do you think the answer is? Expecting him to say tax increases. He said, well, actually, I just think that companies should pay their staff a living wage so that the government doesn't have to come in and subsidize through paying welfare benefits. And we looked at him. This is a progressive policy coming out of a conservative mouth. So he just needed to be protected and fostered and nurtured. So we bigged him up. We got him writing opinion pieces in where other conservatives go. And lo and behold, in the next budget, they raised the living wage. So there are champions, but we have to recognize them wherever they are. We have to facilitate, support, encourage, and midwife them, because it takes courage, particularly when you're in a party structure that doesn't reward that kind of courage and that kind of humanity.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, because I was curious. You know, I didn't know if similar to what we see with CEOs and, you know, around the world, that privately they'll say one thing, but publicly they do something else. If you were actually taking action,
they have to be supported. You know, it's very, we have to recognize what happens to the individual whistleblower. You know, we have more of an understanding of the powerless whistleblower, but the person with power still has the psychological needs of belonging, of you know, however much they think they need, which they don't really need, but we have to respect their psychological need for safety as well. So unless we're compassionate in how we seek to enable and facilitate that courage, we're not going to see it.
Okay. And Marianne, just picking up on the conversation earlier about the void, when you were talking about it, I was thinking about, the experience of being caught in a riptide. And in a riptide, there's a power, the ocean, that is more powerful than the body. And, to surrender means to drown. And so rather than fighting the riptide, you just allow yourself to relax and go with it, knowing that eventually the power of the riptide will diminish enough that you can swim out of it. And so I'm wondering, using that as a metaphor of where we are, is it literally just that it requires time and we just continue to just float? What action and what is it that we need to do in this time when we're in this void?
Well, on one hand, it's kind of like when your car goes out of control.
Mhm.
And the first instinct might be to grab the wheel, and we've all been taught, take your hands off the wheel, because nature has a way of correcting itself. Nature is both self-organizing and self-correcting. You have to take your hands off the wheel. You interrupting right now, you getting in there before it's if it's a self-initiated plan, you're probably just going to contribute to the old. So you have to take your hands off the wheel and go into that space. But nature also, remember, time and space themselves are part of the illusion. So if you go into the quantum, nature also knows when something has to be done quickly. So the consciousness has to be, my hands are off the wheel, but it makes you more alert. It gives you more of an inner ear. And I think within that space right now, we don't have time, but in that space, time doesn't exist in that space. So you get into the complete, my hands are off the wheel, I have no idea. And then that's why I'm telling you why real religious, whether any of the great religious systems, have more information for us right now. Whether, we were talking earlier and I was thinking of Hinduism and the forces of destruction and the forces of creation. I mean, everything people have said today or it's Buddha, it's complete compassion. It's the emptying of the rice bowl. It's the realizing the crucifixion, but what brings the resurrection? It's all of it. It's Moses leading people out, all of it. So we're in the void, but that doesn't mean that there's not stuff to do. But whatever you do is infused with the consciousness with which you do it. So to me, there's something about speaking truth when there's nothing that you can rationally see coming out of it. And that's where the hope comes from. The hope comes from, it's a cry in the wilderness. That when you can't calculate it could succeed, but the abolitionists couldn't calculate success. It was unreasonable to think they could succeed. The suffragists couldn't calculate success. And forgive me, people on this call, who I know I'm speaking from an American-centric perspective, but that's my filter at the moment. It's not because I think it's the only one or the most important one. We can all only speak, though, from what we know. Civil rights movement, there was no reason to think they could succeed. There's something now about the purity that comes from, I'm speaking this truth, even though everyone's against it. There's nothing I can do, but I'm going to speak it. And also to what you just said, Jennifer, you know what? On one hand, you're very right. And I feel it, like, can I get some support here? And I'll tell you something else. Americans have been very good at saying, I support you, but it's bullshit. It doesn't mean anything. It's like, yeah, really? Because I haven't seen, whatever. But when you talked about people have to be given support right now, when I think of the AOCs, when I think of the Cori Bush, when I think of Jamal Bowman, when I think of Bernie Sanders right now, you don't need support, you need conscience and you need courage and you need some chutzpah. You need to say it, whether you know what it's got to be, I'm going to say it even if nobody supports me. That's conviction. And conviction is a force multiplier. And that's what hate has. Hate has conviction. And if I'm not going to I'm not going to say it unless somebody supports me. I think there's something here about say it whether anybody supports you.
Well,
I
super.
totally agree that that is what we want, but people are on a journey, and anything we can do to push more people into the space where they can say that. And as you were talking, I was just thinking about a tuning fork, how that sound is so true that it arrests everything, and that's the quality that truth has, you know, in our public space that is populated by lies, distortions, and hate. That voicing of the truth has an incredible quality.
Well, Jim, you've got a new book coming out that can be helpful in this conversation to talk about how do we manifest this that we're talking about? How do we bring it into reality? And maybe you could speak to that.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. I've written a new book called Mind Magic: The Neuroscience of Manifestation and How It Changes Everything. And for those who might be interested, you can pre-order it now. But beyond that, the point of that book is interesting because many people have bought a book called The Secret, and I'm sure many of the listeners here have heard of that. If you read that book, in some ways, it's very sad because what it talks about is a narrative of self-interest. What do I want? And in some ways, this is a type of prosperity gospel, which frankly is not based on truth. My book actually is the antithesis of this because I look at this from the perspective of not the self, which is very prominent in Western capitalist society. But if you look at how we evolved as a species, what, if you will, connects us, what is actually pleasure for us, what actually promotes the best function of our physiology is to be of service to others. And fundamentally, you have to change your perspective to, it's not about me. What I am doing is to benefit others. What I am doing is living an inspiring life which promotes positive values that embrace everyone. And what happens to so many people in Western society is they buy into this narrative of success, which is position, money, and power. And as many of you who have gone down that path, you get there and there's nothing except emptiness. And this refers back to Jennifer's comment. It's as if you're searching to fill the emptiness which is inside yourself with food that has no nutritional value. The only way you can fill that void is fundamentally based on how we evolved as a species, which is to be of service to others. And when you do that, that changes everything. The other problem for so many people is, and that what puts them on that journey, is they're looking for outside affirmation that says, oh, wow, you're successful. And they hope that this outside affirmation will, again, fill that void. And the problem is the only thing that can fill that void is when you're able to accept yourself. And it is your choice to be happy, frankly. The reality is that each of us has within ourselves an immense amount of power, and we don't realize it because we give so much of it away by listening to others and actually being moved by others, even if that movement is not the best for us as a human being, because so many of us are driven by fear that we make decisions based on that fear, when in fact, in many ways, that fear is self-generated because, again, so many of us don't want to be judged. We're terrified of being judged. We're terrified of standing out there by ourselves and saying, this is who I am. And in fact, it goes back to what Marianne was saying. She is standing there, whether anyone agrees, this is who I am. I stand behind it. This is a narrative that I believe will help everybody. I don't need any protection. This is who I am, and this is what I believe. And I think in some ways, all of us have to be able to stand out and say, I'm okay within myself to accept myself, both good and bad. And I'm okay with that. And that's very hard for a lot of people, unfortunately. So what people will find, though, is if they are able to do that, if they can become self-aware, if they can put forth the energy to look into themselves and understand actually what drives them, because another issue is so many people are driven by baggage that comes from their childhood, that comes from adult trauma, and they don't have any self-awareness of it. And this is, of course, why so many people end up repeating the same mistakes, whether it's with relationships, whether it's decision-making about significant events in their lives, because they don't have that understanding of what's underneath the hood, if you will. And hopefully what my book will do is allow you to look inside yourself and see what's there and embrace the possibilities within yourself to not only change yourself in the sense of your purpose, but also to change yourself into someone who is okay with themselves and is actually happy.
Yeah, I'd like to bring Jim back into the conversation. Carson, is there anything there that you want to speak to around Compassion 2.0 or our discussion today?
Yeah, I just want to say first off, thank you to all three of the guests. I mean, in each in your own way, your work is just tremendous. So the world is a better place for it. So there's that. So thank you. The other thing I would say is for those that are interested in learning more about what Compassion 2.0 is about, you can check us out at compassion2.com. We have a variety of different ways that you can, get an email newsletter or different ways to engage with us and continue to check us out. So that's it really. And to thank you, Tom, and thank you, Jim, for the opportunity to allow us to have this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for a very deep and stimulating dialogue. I'd like to just bring up for you, Marianne, a question around what's going on in the Middle East right now. As a progressive, how would your response, if you were president of the United States, have differed from the response of Joe Biden to what's happening between Hamas and Israel?
Well, my response, everything has changed in the last 3 days, of course. And my response 3 days ago before 3 days ago, would have been very different from Joe Biden's. I would have reversed, certainly I would have moved I would have removed taken the ambassador's residence to put it back, the embassy, put it back to Tel Aviv. I would have realized that the Abraham Accords, to say that the Abraham Accords were peace building was ridiculous because they continue to minimize the needs of the Palestinians. I would have realized that brokering a deal between the Saudi Arabians and the Israelis was not what we should have been doing because it could only piss off Iran. And we certainly know that now. I would have been very, very vocal that while we love you, Israel, there will be no peace without justice. There will be no, there's no military solution to this. That's clear now. That you must end the occupation, that you must deal with the settlements, they're illegal, that you must realize the blockade is wrong. And while the current billions of dollars that we give in military aid is based on a memorandum of understanding, the president cannot unilaterally take that back. That's there until 2028. That would take a congressional act. However, the president, I would have said, I absolutely can unilaterally demand that none of that money is used for the occupation. None of that money is used to transgress any values that we purport, which we purport to stand. Everything has changed now, and part of the tragedy of what is occurring, beyond just the enormity of the human tragedy, the enormity. So many Israelis and so many Palestinians are going to die now.
Mm-hmm.
The enormity of this is that Hamas has moved back, has taken us backwards in the cause for Palestinian justice for decades, if not centuries. The last thing any Israeli government or even citizen, even the most left-wing Israeli citizen is ready to hear right now is you really need to end the occupation. Because in their mind right now, oh, so you think Hamas should be on both sides, do you? Nobody in the world expected the United States to not go after Al-Qaeda after 9/11. And nobody in the world, for reasonableness, is expecting the Israel not to go after Hamas. And yet, people have talked about Ukraine being a proxy war. That's nothing compared to this proxy war. This is about Iran. This is so dangerous. We are at a moment, I think a lot of people haven't even taken in yet how serious this is.
Oh, I completely agree. So what would you in this, I want to really probe here in real time.
Okay.
What a progressive consciousness would do. So
First of all,
what moves would you make on the chessboard right now, given the fact that the Israelis are about ready to clobber the Palestinians in Gaza? Probably.
Let's be very clear, because I think the left, I would really appreciate if the left would be very clear here. When the Israeli military commander said they are animals, he was not speaking about the Palestinians, he was speaking about Hamas. And there are people who have, and I have been with them, but if it is as wrong to disregard the suffering of a Jew as it is wrong to disregard the suffering of a Palestinian. And right now, also people should be aware. Israel, where it is right now, doesn't care what anybody says, including the American president. And there's an aspect of the Jewish psyche post-World War II that is operative here, that is a factor that we should all realize. There are many, what has happened is, as we all know about reactions of trauma, the Israeli politics is based on having been traumatized by the Nazis. Palestinian consciousness has been based on having been traumatized by the Israelis. And if I haven't been cleared of my own trauma, I don't have the capacity to be present for your suffering. One aspect of the unprocessed trauma from World War II that is operative in the Israeli political sphere is, you weren't there for us when they came to kill us last time. We're going to do whatever it takes this time to survive, and fuck you if you don't like it. Therefore, nothing the US president can say right now, one way or the other. Israel military intelligence, they have so spectacularly failed. This is so, that to think that anything the US president could say right now, that's how enormous this is. It's time for prayer. Now, in terms of my position, when it can be heard, would be what it has always been. The occupation is illegal. You've got to stop. There will be no peace until justice, etc. But right now, Jim, and I have felt this with Ukraine as well. A lot of people on the American left have this idea that it's a unipolar world. It's a multipolar world now. And they act like the Americans are just going to decide what's going to happen now. It's not that simple. No, we're not. The American president is not going to be dictating to Netanyahu what's going to happen now. And if the American president even said, slow down, I think it's irrelevant to them right now. But what should not be, and to be honest, I think we should all, if ever there was a time when we need to come out of our silos, because what conservatives are saying, they have some good points right now, as well as the left. Nobody has a monopoly on truth when it comes to this one. Nobody has a monopoly on truth. There are many aspects of this, and we need to get out of our sophomoric, our side looks at it this way. We need a whole new level of thinking. And that, as president, what would matter is not what I would quote unquote do, because there's very little the American president can do at the moment to change anything. But I can tell you my consciousness would be as I've just described.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. There's no doubt that we need someone in the White House at this moment that has a level of consciousness that can, like President Kennedy back in the 1960s, actually empathize with the other side. The extraordinary capacity of John Kennedy, as you know from his famous speech at American University in 1963, was his capacity to understand the suffering of the Russian people, and out of that awareness, reach out to Khrushchev in the midst of all those tensions and negotiate the nuclear test ban treaty. And a final question that I'd like to put to you, and I'm just taking advantage, everyone, of the presidential campaign and some of the real issues around democracy that you've been talking about. You know, Bobby Kennedy Jr. has just dropped out of the race for the Democratic nomination because he has been so systematically excluded, and the DNC has so clearly stated that not only will there be no debates, but the votes in, you know, New Hampshire, South Carolina, et cetera, in the early primaries aren't even really going to be counted. So what's the point? And I'm just wondering, given what we've been talking about in terms of democracy and compassion and so forth, how are you experiencing in your own campaign the lack of democratic processes and transparencies in the Democratic primary system? And are you planning to stay in the Democratic primary running, or are you contemplating like RFK Jr., an independent run? I know there's been lots of speculation of what would happen if you and Bobby would team up. So I just would love to just get your sense of the viability of your campaign in the process that is obviously a reality that has forced Kennedy out, and just what your thinking is about the next 6 months of campaigning.
Bobby's description of the situation is 100% accurate.
Yeah.
And I've said it as well. And the suppression of his campaign that he has experienced is exactly that of mine. You have to pay $20,000, please, to get on the ballot in South Carolina. However, then we will tell you whether or not we will allow you to be on the ballot. We won't consider it unless you give us the $20,000. But then we will decide whether or not you can be on the ballot based on what we think is enough attention from the media. It is blockage everywhere you go. It is exactly what Bobby said. Bobby and I align on corporate capture. We align on the fact that corporate greed is the cancer. Donald Trump is the symptom. He is not the cause. Bobby has a way of diagnosing a problem, which is what any progressive would like. But if the progressive stays for the rest of the sentence, his solutions are right-wing libertarianism. His solutions are, I'm a capitalist. I'm a right-wing, I think his answer to the climate solution is the discipline of the free market. His answer, to everything is, I'm a free market capitalism guy. And it's kind of scary, Jim, because he starts the sentence with a real humanitarian progressive perspective. And then he switches over into, well, just let Steve, conversation that is, like I said, right-wing libertarianism. So no, he's an acquaintance. I've known Bobby for years. I wouldn't say he's a friend, but he's an acquaintance, certainly. But I don't see how we team up with that when, to me, the problem is unfettered capitalism, vulture capitalism, trickle-down economics.
But you're going to stay in the
Well, I wouldn't say that.
primary process.
Well, what I'm saying is he's right. So I'm in the void on that. It's another microcosm of everything we're saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly what everybody's saying. Do I go away? Like, clearly they're telling me to go away, but you create what you defend against. They're telling Bobby to go away. They've created a bigger problem for themselves. That's a metaphysical principle. You create what you defend against. So I'm in that void, Jim.
Yeah.
in every way that and I'm like, do I stop? Do I go? But I'll tell you something I experience when I talk to audiences. People are ready. The American people are not the problem. That's what makes this such a tragic moment. It makes it such a tragic moment in the Middle East. It's the same thing. The majority, there was the consciousness of real peace building there among Palestinians and Israelis. I've seen it. I think many people have seen it. So I don't know. I'm in the void. I'm in everything that we've talked about here.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Jennifer and Carson and Jim. Splendid conversation. We've come to the outer limits of our time. Tom, why don't you tee us up for tomorrow, and we'll bring the session to a close. But this has been very rich and textured, everyone. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for being with us today. It's been a wonderful conversation in one of the many facets of compassion and why we need Compassion 2.0 more than ever. Tomorrow, we're going to go to a slightly different facet or dimension of compassion. We're going to be talking about architected, compassionate human experiences in organizations and society at large, and just bringing that intentionality to architecting our experiences as leaders in organizations and in society. How do we bring that intentionality to the human experience? So thank you all for being with us today, and looking forward to our conversation tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, everyone. The one thing that I would just note as we close is this notion, Marianne, that you brought out of the void. For a political candidate to acknowledge that she's in the void is maybe unprecedented in modern times. But this willingness to have a consciousness of unknowing is, I think, the foundation and cornerstone of the kind of humane politics and compassionate interactivity that we're all seeking. It's in the knowing that we are so destructive at times. And so I just really appreciated, Marianne, your humility in this call, and your willingness, even in the face of something as dire as the Middle Eastern situation, to say, there's nothing we can do about it right now. But I'm going to hold this consciousness, and at the right time, make the kind of moves that would be appropriate in that space. I just want to acknowledge that in you, and that willingness to be beginner's mind in the face of the complexity, because I think out of that comes the authentic response of higher truth. And whether you're running for president, or you're doing the politics of compassion in the UK, or writing a book on neuroscience, my sense is that that's a truism for the human community at this moment. And if we would all relax into truth pursued rather than truth possessed, things would get clear and more easily solved immeasurably. So thank you all. That'll do it for us for today. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box, and then we'll see everybody again tomorrow for day 3 of our 5-day program on Compassion 2.0.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
God bless you.
Thank you.